Eye on the Storm, Hurricane Season 2019.
Hey there and good evening. Welcome to Eye on the Storm. This is your weekly in-depth look at the tropics and how it will impact you. I'm CBS 17 Chief Meteorologist Wes Hohenstein here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Tonight, even though fall is in full effect on the East Coast, things are still kind of busy in the Atlantic Ocean, so we're going to spend some time diving into what's going on in the tropics now. We're also going to talk with our consumer investigator on what the government does to prosecute those who try to take advantage of others during a storm. It's happened a few times the last several years. The bad guys are out there in good weather and in bad, so we'll show you what to look out for. I'll also be joined by meteorologist Tyler Allender from WJHL from the Tri-Cities in eastern Tennessee as we look back just about 1 year ago to when Hurricane Michael made landfall in Florida. Now, during tonight's show, if there's anything you would like to know or subjects you would like us to talk about tonight or even in the next couple of weeks, if you got some ideas, drop us an email. That is sendit@cbs17.com. Our digital team is monitoring that email address. As for getting in touch with me and our other guests tonight directly, the best way to do that is on social media. You can find me at Weather Wes Hohenstein on Facebook, and you can find Tyler, who lived through Michael firsthand in Florida. You can find him at Tyler Allender WX. But before we get to our guests, let's take a look at what's going on right now in the tropics. And let me start with some statistics, okay? 20% of all hurricanes during the whole hurricane season form after today. Today's October 9th. So 20%, think about that. 20% of all activity happens after today. So the season's not over with. We know that. We just went through the anniversary of Hurricane Matthew. Hurricane Michael's anniversary is coming up, so things can still happen. In fact, in 2005 and in 1950, 7 named storms formed after October 9th. Can you imagine? Those were busy years. October 2005 was part of that record year, but in 2 different times in history, 7 named storms have formed after today. Now, because of what we see coming down the road, we don't anticipate that this year, but it could happen. Right now, there are actually 3 things that we're keeping an eye on, as well as the National Hurricane Center, none of which we're overly worried about, but the fact that there's 3 things out there tells you that the Atlantic is still kind of primed, ready to go if the conditions change. The farthest one away from us, we'll start there, is still way out in the Atlantic. You can see there's a little circulation trying to go, but there's just not a lot of cloud thunderstorm activity. There's only a 10% chance of that developing. The 2 closer ones that are now moving away from the East Coast have a 20 and 10% chance of developing. Let's kind of switch views, zoom in a little closer to those. So now they're a little farther to the right on this different map. But first of all, you just kind of step back and look at them, and you don't really see any kind of circulation. You don't see any organized cloud structure. And if anything, it almost looks like they're getting blown, like someone's standing here with a fan, blowing them away out to sea. They're kind of getting sheared apart, but they are organized enough to still be producing some thunderstorm activity. The big story for the East Coast is that cold front that moved through. You know, this time of year is when we start to get some real cold fronts. Those cold fronts really help steer away and change the conditions where if there is a tropical system out there, they don't really want to come here. And a lot of times the winds and the currents will help pull them away from the East Coast. But October, as we've talked about, could still be busy. So where are we in the season? Well, remember, we have made it through 12 named storms. We haven't had anything in a while since Lorenzo, but that was a monster. Next up on the list, if we do get some named storms, it would be Melissa and Nestor. Melissa and Nestor next on our named list. As for where systems form this time of year, we try to keep you updated on this throughout the entire season. Each month, there's different climatology, of where storms form. Early on in the season, it's in the warmer waters where you expect farther south, but as we go throughout the season, like where we are now in October, and the formation spots really expand to anywhere, because if you think about it, the summer months heat up the water all over the Atlantic, so warm water helps storms form, and that can happen anywhere. So anywhere you see a green dot, that is where a tropical storm formed. Anywhere you see a blue dot is where a storm formed to become a Category 1 or 2 hurricane. And a red dot is where a storm formed that eventually became a major hurricane. So it could happen anywhere. So obviously, we'll keep an eye on anywhere, but right now, we're also heading on the downslope of the season. We show you this graphic throughout the season. This is a graph of the tropical activity throughout the year. So we go across left to right. That's our time throughout the summer and fall. And the higher up you go, the more activity over the last 100 years. Red is hurricanes and tropical storms combined. The yellow is just the hurricanes. The climatological peak, there's that word again, climatological, September 10th. Well, we are well on the downslope. But as you can see, there's this little kind of valley that peaks again. So there is definitely activity that happens in October. So while the season still runs until the end of November, it's really through October that we really have to keep our guard up. So as far as when storms form, and a lot of people are surprised about this, you know, the busiest months, August and September, no surprise there. The third busiest month for when hurricanes form, 17% in October. So that's busier than June and July combined. Usually there's nothing really to worry about in November, but October is the third busiest hurricane month. And here's one of the reasons why. If you look at the current sea surface temperatures, you get into these deep reds, that's anything above 80 degrees, and you can see it spread all over the Atlantic. And 80 degrees is kind of the magic number that you need the water temperature to be to actually get a hurricane to form. So it's still out there, but why isn't there anything out there? Well, a couple of reasons. One of them is we've had some cold fronts on the East Coast. We've also had some African dust coming off the coast of Africa. That gets up there in the atmosphere and can tend to limit formation, especially way out in the Atlantic. But I want to show you something that's going to happen over the next week. So here's our current African Saharan dust now. You can see that's probably holding down activity farther in the eastern Atlantic. But let's kind of put this into motion. I'm going to take you through this weekend, take you all the way into next week, and look how things kind of calm down when it comes to the dust forecast. So again, that could mean something could come together as we head into the next week. There's not going to be as much prohibiting it. But we also know that things happen this time of year. Matthew and Michael. You know, it's been almost a year since Michael, a Category 5 hurricane, made landfall in Florida. Michael is only the fourth Category 5 hurricane ever to hit the United States. There have been other Category 5 storms out there, but most of them stay out to sea, or they weaken by the time they get here. Category 5 land strikes in recorded history in the United States has only happened 4 times. 3 of them have been in Florida. Andrew in '92, the Labor Day hurricane in 1935, that hit before we named hurricanes. And then Michael last year, 160-mile-per-hour winds. The only one not to hit Florida that made U.S. landfall was Hurricane Camille back in 1969, and that came inland right around Pass Christian, Mississippi. So Michael was a big deal. The interesting thing about Michael, and I know it was a year ago, but 3 days before Michael made landfall as a Category 5 hurricane, 3 days before it had 160-mile-per-hour winds, it was a tropical storm with 50-mile-an-hour winds. So let's say today being a Wednesday, 3 days from now, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. So let's say I showed you a tropical storm right now down in the Caribbean with 50-mile-an-hour winds. By Saturday, making landfall as a Category 5 hurricane on the panhandle of Florida. An amazing intensification that happened with Hurricane Michael. And Hurricane Michael's on a lot of lists now. I showed you a couple of them. The strongest landfalling hurricanes ever are right here. Labor Day in 1935, we showed you that one, 185. Michael is 4th on the list. That's a pretty big deal, and it's already been a year. And that landfall happened near Mexico Beach and Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida, produced devastating winds and storm surge near the coast, rain and wind inland. We got some here in North Carolina. Meteorologist Tyler Allender was covering the storm in Florida, and we spoke with him earlier today about what life was like as a Category 5 hurricane was hitting Florida.
It's been 1 year since Hurricane Michael, hard to believe, and since that time I moved from Panama City, where I was working at a TV station there, and now I'm working in the Tri-Cities area of Tennessee and Virginia. We also serve some of the counties in western North Carolina and eastern Kentucky. So it's been quite a change, but Michael is still very much fresh on my mind. A lot of things leading up to the storm, during and after the storm as well. Now, what was interesting is about 5 or 6 days before Hurricane Michael made landfall, this was not even looking like much of a system. We weren't even sure if this was going to develop. And you can see what it ended up doing as it was getting ready to make landfall on October 10th, 2018. I was actually scheduled for a 4-day weekend, the Friday through Monday before the storm hit. And that Friday that I was off, I was starting to watch the system from home. It wasn't even a tropical depression or tropical storm at the time. It was a tropical disturbance that might develop. And so I told everybody to keep an eye on it. And little did I know that my vacation, my staycation, would be cut short, and I would end up going into work really monitoring the system, what eventually became Michael, all weekend long. And then by the time we got into Monday, I had to go to work because I just knew this system was becoming more and more urgent. So here was the first forecast that the National Hurricane Center put out. This was on Saturday, October 6th, 4 days before it hit land in Northwest Florida. It was basically a tropical depression. Okay, actually it was not even quite there yet, but this was the first forecast path. It had it making landfall as a tropical storm in the panhandle of Florida. Pretty close as far as the actual location, but the intensity was way off. And that's where we have to work on as far as some of the best forecasters in the world from the National Hurricane Center. It's so tricky to forecast the intensity of these systems. They're so fickle in the beginning. So the next day, it was still pretty weak, and it became a hurricane by Monday, October 8th, okay? Winds of 75 miles an hour. It was getting a little more serious, and it looked like, well, here we are on the 8th, 2 days out, that it was going to be a major hurricane making landfall in my area and affecting my viewing area. So definitely a serious storm, and my messaging, I really had to ramp up on that on social media. So on October 8th, for example, I said all of Northwest Florida is under a hurricane warning, meaning conditions will most likely go downhill late Tuesday night into Wednesday, and you will want to shelter in place. We have to prepare for sustained winds at least around 75 miles an hour. Gusts could be easily in excess of 100. As you go and look at some of the previous hours and days after that, I said on October 9th, the day before, this is pretty much it. A worst case scenario continues to take shape for Northwest Florida. As of 4 p.m. Tuesday, Michael's a Category 3. Further strengthening is expected. This is the real deal. You need to shelter in place on high ground in a very sturdy shelter this evening if you're riding the storm out here. Then I said this is not a drill. Monster Michael is getting better organized. Life-threatening storm surge, hurricane force winds, heavy rain expected in Northwest Florida. And then I said the day that it made landfall. Here we are. Our worst nightmare will move in as the day goes on. Know that you and your family are in my prayers. We will be here for you in such a difficult time. We will be stronger after this as we clean up. There will be big swaths of destruction from storm surge and wind. So you can see the progression just in the matter of hours and days of how my messaging became more serious to my viewers and my fans on social media. Nowadays, it's not just television. We're on this digital platform that we're doing, Eye on the Storm, and even just Facebook posts with pictures and video that get the word out is so important these days. I made the very difficult, not even decision, but it was just, I had to do it. I had to say goodbye to my then fiance at the time because I was going to inevitably have to stay at the TV station that I worked for several days. That's my bags. That's my beautiful fiance, now my wife. And, you know, it was tough saying goodbye. I went in, I left the house on that Tuesday morning, the day before landfall, and I said it'd be at least 3 days probably before I see you. And really, I was at work for 5 days. I slept at the station for 5 days straight. So that was quite an experience. And your adrenaline is just pumping. This was during the storm or really right after the storm and seeing some of the damage. We were on Panama City Beach, so our particular TV station, you know, fared better than some others, but you could see the trees kind of bending and there was some definite damage. from that vantage point. This was in the aftermath of the storm, and this is what you saw up and down the streets of Panama City, parts of Panama City Beach, the Bay County area, all the way up through Youngstown, Lynn Haven, even Mariana. We had Category 2, Category 3 winds up through Georgia. So, I mean, just huge trees snapped all over the place, some roads impassable. You could see the bright sunshine the day after the storm. It was just unreal. Some people trapped in their home for days. Some people didn't have power until after Halloween. Obviously, cable and internet took until November, December in some cases to be restored. It was just a nightmare, and communication was also a problem too. I couldn't get a hold of my fiance for 36 hours until I literally drove to the house to try to find her, and by that point, she was already trying to find me. This was when our newsroom kind of went dark. We covered the computers. We had leaks. It was a little bit of a nightmare following the storm in the past several hours afterward because our generator failed and we couldn't get that back up and running for 5 or 6 hours. And then we kind of came up with a plan from there. Some of the damage that we'd see from some of the apartment complexes and homes, just catastrophic damage. And this was in Panama City. Some areas to the east, like in Callaway, Springfield, had even more intense damage, even though that was hard to believe. And this isn't an amusement park ride. It is actually a cell phone tower that was snapped. That's why communication was just cut off from the outside world. And really, if you were on the ground there, you couldn't get in touch with your loved ones, and your loved ones couldn't get in touch with you. It was quite a bear. There's those trees that were snapped after the storm. And that's what you saw. I mean, just hundreds of thousands of trees just like that. It didn't matter what you looked like in the days following when you did online coverage and on-air coverage. Whoever could see us, we wore polos, T-shirts, shorts. As meteorologists, that's my boss at the time, Chief Meteorologist Chris Smith, and we didn't shave. So we just had to get the message across at that point on how to basically recover and start piecing your life back together. So what a time it was. It was about a year ago. Thursday is the 1-year anniversary, and not in a good way, but it's something that I'll always remember for my career because I learned that communication is important, and emotion is important too because you have to be real to people. 24 hours before the storm hit, I kind of got a little emotional on air, and I had people telling me that saved lives because they knew they had to get out, and I was just being real. So a lot of lessons learned, and I think in the aftermath, it was just all about getting information out to people because they were desperate. They couldn't get in touch with their loved ones. It was all about information and communication in whatever form you could do it, however it looked. It didn't matter if it was primitive or not. Wes?
All right, Tyler, good stuff. Most of us, thankfully, will never go through a Cat 5, so appreciate you sharing. Certainly overwhelming to hear. Now, Michael did an estimated $18 billion in damage in Florida alone. And being just a year out, parts of Florida are still cleaning up today. Luckily, Tyler had a much more positive perspective of the community supporting one another during Michael. But hurricanes are also the perfect storms for those trying to take advantage of people. And in the state of North Carolina, our Attorney General aggressively prosecutes those who engage in those acts, especially price gouging. Our consumer investigator here in Raleigh, Steve Sprasia, has tips on what you should watch out for.
When storms like this blow in, there are those who take advantage. As soon as the state of emergency is declared, the state's price gouging law kicks in, which means excessive and unreasonable prices are prohibited even before the storm strikes. Price gouging can involve anything from gasoline to grocery prices to hotels and rental cars. That happened in Cumberland County after Hurricane Matthew, when a man found his rental car rates doubled.
I was paying $30 a day. So that meant when I brought it back on Monday, I would have to pay $60 a day.
After Hurricanes Florence and Michael struck the state within 2 weeks of each other last year, the Attorney General's office dealt with over 800 price gouging complaints.
There are people out there who have bad intention, and they will take advantage of people's most desperate situation.
After last year's hurricanes, an out-of-state tree company was found guilty of price gouging, prohibited from ever doing business here again, and it must repay victims.
We just got a $275,000 settlement, and we're going to fully refund everybody that person scammed.
The state's price gouging law includes all levels of the supply chain, from manufacturer to distributor to retailer, can include fines of up to $5,000 for each violation, and can be reported by you online or by phone. North Carolina has some of the toughest price gouging laws in the country. If you think you've been victimized, keep your receipts or other proof of payments and file a complaint. Getting answers for you, I'm consumer investigator Steve Sprazier.
All right, that's Steve Sprazier. I want to thank him and Tyler for helping us out tonight as we continue to keep an eye on the tropics. And thank you for joining us on tonight's Eye on the Storm. Don't forget, we're here every Wednesday night at 8 o'clock throughout the Atlantic hurricane season. Thank you for spending part of your night with us live in Raleigh, North Carolina. I'm Wes Hohenstein.